A pilot made a terrible mistake and 583 people died when two airliners collided in the world's deadliest aviation disaster. Unfortunately, this tragedy was just one of the 10 deadliest pilot mistakes in history, and the reason why some of these disasters happened is quite shocking, especially this one, where they actually landed the aircraft but then made a terrible mistake and everyone died. Although you might be familiar with a few of these, my guess is you probably don't know them all, and that's why I wanted to share with you a short summary of the 10 deadliest pilot mistakes in aviation history. So sit back and buckle up. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. The first disaster on our list took place on July 10, 1985 in the Soviet Union when 200 people boarded Aeroflot 5143, a commercial airliner conducting a routine domestic flight out of what is now modern-day Uzbekistan. Unfortunately, they had no idea the flight would soon become their worst nightmare, and the reason why they crashed would shock everyone. The aircraft they were flying was a 1978 Tupolev Tu-154, which is a 3-engine, medium-range, narrow-body airliner that was designed in the 1960s and a workhorse of the Russian airlines for several decades. According to the investigation, there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft at the time of the crash. The pilot flying the plane was 48 years old, and he had logged over 12,000 hours of total flight time, including almost 3,400 hours on the Tu-154. The co-pilot was also highly experienced with over 12,000 total hours, including over 1,600 hours on the aircraft. Also sitting in the cockpit was a 41-year-old navigator and a 32-year-old flight engineer. The aircraft was originally scheduled to depart at 18:45 local time, but due to the late arrival of the aircraft, they didn't get airborne until a little over 4 hours later at 2300. Almost immediately after takeoff, the flight crew engaged the autopilot for their initial climb to altitude, and as they passed through 18,000 feet, everything seemed normal and the pilots selected the pitch stabilization mode for the autopilot. This meant the aircraft was going to maintain a specific pitch angle in order to achieve the maximum rate of climb, which at that point was 6 degrees nose high. Now technically there was nothing wrong with them doing that as long as they continued to monitor the airspeed. And the reason why that's important is because at higher altitudes with a heavyweight aircraft, it's going to be very difficult to maintain that 6-degree nose-high pitch without sacrificing airspeed and slowing down. Unfortunately, they made a huge mistake and they weren't paying attention, and as the aircraft continued to climb, the airspeed slowly began to decrease, and about 40 minutes after takeoff, when they finally managed to reach their cruising altitude of 38,000 feet, they had actually slowed down to roughly 220 knots or 0.4 Mach. This was extremely dangerous because it was less than half of their normal cruise speed and they were very close to stalling the aircraft. Now the truth is that when the pilots saw this, for some reason almost immediately one of them pulled back on the controls and brought the aircraft to 10 degrees nose high. And at that point the aircraft began to stall. And what you need to know is that regardless of whether you're flying a small Cessna or a large commercial airliner, the most important thing you need to do to recover from a stall is to push forward on the controls in order to reduce the angle of attack. Simultaneously, you also want to add power to help increase the airspeed and get the aircraft flying again. Thankfully, the aircraft had a stall warning system, so when all of this happened, it sounded an alarm and it activated a stall recovery mode of the autopilot, where the autopilot essentially took over and it moved the controls forward to reduce the angle of attack, and the aircraft began a 5-degree nose-low dive. Now that should have been the end of the story. But instead what happened was when the stall alarm warning first sounded, for some reason one of the crew members pulled the engine throttles back to the idle position. That's the exact opposite of what you want to do to recover from a stall. And the investigation said that it was likely that the pilots felt some aircraft vibration because of the stall, but they assumed it was a compressor stall, which is an engine malfunction. So they pulled the throttles back to idle to correct a problem that didn't exist. And that's also probably why about 15 seconds later, the crew deactivated the stall warning system. And for about the next 30 to 45 seconds, the pilot would pull back on the controls, the aircraft would shake, warning him of the stall, and he momentarily pushed forward to reduce the angle of attack, but not long enough to ever recover. 77 seconds after that stall warning first sounded, the aircraft went into a flat spin, and the passengers spent the next 2 minutes and 33 seconds in terror as the aircraft fell out of the sky. One of the crew members made a radio call passing through 30,000 feet, reporting that all 3 engines had failed. And as they passed through 10,000 feet, they finally managed to stop the spin, but by that point they were too low to recover and they slammed into the ground, killing all 200 people on board the aircraft instantly. The Russian investigation authorities said the cause of the accident was the aircraft stalling in a flat spin because the crew failed to pilot the aircraft. However, the shocking truth is the reason they weren't paying attention to their airspeed during the climb was most likely because they had all fallen asleep after they had been forced to stay awake at the airport for 24 hours prior to the flight. Now, what's crazy to me is even though they might have fallen asleep, they still had 77 seconds to recover from the stall before they entered the spin, but somehow they forgot the basics of how to fly an aircraft. Unfortunately, this tragedy isn't the deadliest disaster on our list. Our next disaster took place on February 16, 1998, when China Airlines Flight 676 was flying from Indonesia to Taiwan. Most of the flight was uneventful, but when they were moments away from landing, something went terribly wrong and they crashed in a residential area, killing over 200 people. The aircraft they were flying was a 1990 Airbus A300, which was the world's first twin-engine, double-aisle, wide-body airliner. And just like most of these disasters, there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft that contributed to the crash. The pilot flying the plane was 49 years old, and he had over 7,000 hours of total flight time, including almost 2,400 hours on the A300. The first officer sitting in the right seat was 45 years old, and he had about 3,500 hours of total time, but only 304 hours on the A300. One of the biggest issues the investigation discovered was that the captain acted in a very authoritative manner throughout the entire flight, and the first officer would become overwhelmed anytime he had to deal with more than one thing at a time. Now, it's not clear if this was because he was nervous due to the way the captain was treating him, or maybe he was just a struggling pilot. Either way, it doesn't really matter, because the important thing you need to keep in mind is that the captain is the pilot in command, and that means they're the one responsible for setting the tone for the flight and making sure that the first officer isn't afraid to speak up when they think that something is wrong. That being said, about 4 hours into the flight, as the pilots started to prepare for landing, they learned that the current weather observation at their destination was broken clouds at 300 feet and overcast at 1,000. That meant the pilots needed to fly an instrument approach, and the captain started getting things set up for the ILS to runway 05 left. This is a very standard approach, and this is a copy of the approach chart that was included with the investigation. As the pilots started the approach, they were cleared down to 4,000 feet. But the only problem was the captain had just called for the approach checklist, and that got them distracted, and that meant they never acknowledged the radio call, and the controller didn't repeat it. Instead of continuing their descent, they started to level off at 7,000 feet. Several moments later, the controller gave them a heading to fly to intercept the final approach course, and once again cleared them down to 4,000 feet. This time, the first officer acknowledged the radio call, but he also recognized they were high, and he told the captain, only 16 miles to runway, now altitude 7,000 feet. Now, what's interesting to me is that he didn't tell the captain that anything was wrong. Instead, he was essentially hoping the captain would figure it out. And the truth is that if you look at the approach chart, at 16 miles, they should be at 4,000 feet. So they were 3,000 feet high. Unfortunately, the captain didn't either process the information or he didn't care because he continued the approach with a normal rate of descent. A few minutes later, when they were at the final approach fix about 5 miles from the runway, they were still about 1,000 feet high, and that's when the captain finally recognized something was wrong. But instead of calling for the go-around, he said, "We are too high, go down further, it doesn't matter." At this point, they were falling behind the aircraft, and the first officer was trying to help the captain configure the aircraft, complete the landing checklist, switch the radio to talk to the tower, and get their landing clearance. Keep in mind that they're still in the weather, so they can't see the runway, and the first officer was quickly becoming overwhelmed, especially because the captain kept yelling at him. As the aircraft continued to descend on the approach, they were so high that they were starting to get interference with the false glide slope signal, and the aircraft nose started to rise. The captain couldn't figure out what was going on, so he pushed forward aggressively on the controls to lower the nose, trying to descend faster. However, as soon as he did that, it disengaged the autopilot, which generated a warning, but one of the pilots silenced the warning, and neither of them said anything about the fact that the autopilot was now turned off. A few seconds later, they crossed the runway threshold, and because they were still 1,000 feet high, the captain finally decided to call for a go-around. Unfortunately, they had never briefed the go-around procedures, and up until that point, the captain hadn't given any indication that they might go around, so this probably caught the first officer off guard. The captain said, "Positive, gear up," but the first officer was confused and asked gear down. The reason why he was confused was because the first step of the go-around involved retracting the flaps, so at this point he probably had no idea what was going on. Also, as part of the go-around procedure, the captain increased the engine thrust to the full takeoff and go-around power setting, and based on the aircraft trim and that excess thrust, the nose started to pitch up and they began climbing away from the ground. The only problem was the captain assumed that the autopilot was flying the aircraft, and so he let go of the controls, and for the next 11 seconds, no one was flying the plane. During that time, the thrust from the engines kept pushing the nose higher until it reached a maximum of 42 degrees nose high, and the stall warning was heard as the airspeed decreased to 76 knots. By the time the captain finally realized what was happening and he tried to regain control of the aircraft, they were nose down and in 79 degrees of left bank and too close to the ground to recover. They crashed in a residential area next to the runway, killing all 196 people on board and 7 people on the ground. The investigation determined that the captain was ultimately the one to blame for this tragedy, and I think this mishap just shows you how dangerous it can be when you have an authoritative captain and poor crew resource management. Our next disaster took place on January 1st, 1978, when Air India Flight 855, a Boeing 747, took off from Mumbai, India, and crashed less than 2 minutes after takeoff, making it India's deadliest plane crash at that time. The captain flying the plane was 51 years old, and he had almost 18,000 total flight hours, and the first officer was 43 years old, and he had more than 4,500 flight hours. Also in the cockpit was a 53-year-old flight engineer who had 11,000 flight hours, making him one of Air India's most senior flight engineers at the time of the accident. When it comes to the investigation, we don't have a lot of details because it happened such a long time ago. However, what we do know is that about 1 minute after takeoff, the aircraft made a right-hand turn on course, but when the captain rolled left to stop the turn and return to wings level, that's when he noticed that something was wrong. He looked down and saw that his attitude indicator still showed that he was in a right-hand turn, and he said, "What's happened here? My instruments have toppled." Now, my guess is that he was probably initially very disoriented because he wasn't using the autopilot, and even though they weren't flying in the weather, it was nighttime and they were flying over the dark ocean, so they didn't have a visible horizon to reference. That being said, he was smart enough to recognize that something was wrong with his instruments, and the next thing he should have done was look over at the first officer's attitude indicator to confirm what was happening. However, he was already so disoriented that he didn't do that. Instead, he kept turning the controls to the left, which in his mind was turning them back to wings level. As he was doing that, upon hearing the captain's concern, the first officer looked down at his own attitude indicator, and it correctly displayed the aircraft now in a slight left-hand turn. However, for some reason, the first officer said, "Mine has also toppled, looks fine." Now, I'm not sure why he said that because it doesn't make any sense, because the first officer's instrument hadn't toppled, and it was showing the correct attitude in that slight left-hand turn. Unfortunately, this just made the captain more confused, so instead of double-checking the instruments, he continued to increase the bank angle turning to the left. Surprisingly, the only person who seemed to know what was going on was the flight engineer. He was looking at the backup attitude indicator, and he realized that they were now in a steep left-hand turn, and he tried telling the captain, "Don't go by that one, don't go by that one," but tragically it was too late. The captain had already made an aggressive left turn, increasing the bank angle to 108 degrees, and less than 2 minutes after takeoff, they crashed into the sea, killing all 190 passengers and 23 crew members on board. I think the shocking part about this tragedy is that it could have been easily avoided with a little bit better crew resource management. However, I think it's a good reminder of the dangers of spatial disorientation and the importance of understanding your instrument indications and what to do when you get in an unusual attitude situation. Our next deadly pilot mistake took place on June 1st, 2009, when a routine flight from Brazil to Paris turned into a 3.5-minute ride of terror for everyone on board. Air France 447 is an Airbus A330, and although the aircraft is designed to be flown by two pilots, due to the extended duty time, this flight required a captain and two first officers, with one of the first officers acting as a relief pilot. The captain's name was Mark, and he was 58 years old, and he had almost 11,000 total flight hours, with about 1,700 hours in the A330. The first officer that was acting as the relief pilot was David, and he had about 6,500 total hours, including 4,500 hours in the A330. The other first officer was 32-year-old Pierre, and he had almost 3,000 total hours, including 800 hours in the aircraft. About 3 hours after departure, they were at their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet and just beginning the heart of their journey across the Atlantic Ocean when they noticed some bad weather in front of them. Pierre was a little nervous about it, and he was asking the captain if they should climb, but the captain didn't seem too concerned and said they'd wait a little bit and see. A few minutes later, the captain left the cockpit to begin his rest break, and David showed up to take over the pilot monitoring duties, and Pierre was the one flying the plane when things started to go wrong. A few minutes later, the aircraft entered an area of turbulence and ice crystals began to accumulate on the aircraft. Pierre turned the aircraft to the left to get out of the icing, and he slowed down to 0.8 Mach because that was the recommended speed for flying in turbulence, and he turned on the engine anti-ice system. Unfortunately, what he didn't realize was that ice crystals had accumulated in the aircraft pitot tubes on the exterior of the aircraft. The pitot tubes are extremely important because one of the functions they provide is they measure airspeed, and when they got blocked by the ice crystals, the bad data caused the flight computer to generate inaccurate readings and false warnings. First, the autopilot disengaged and the aircraft started rolling to the right. Pierre grabbed the control stick and immediately initiated a roll to the left to stabilize the aircraft. This is where it's very important to understand that the Airbus A330 has a complex set of flight control laws that are designed to provide protections to prevent the pilot from stalling the aircraft, amongst other things. That's called normal law. Well, when you start having sensor failures, the aircraft transitions from normal law to alternate law, meaning that the flight envelope protections are removed and the autopilot and auto thrust stop working. However, there's also alternate law 2, which is specific to the loss of airspeed data. That means no autopilot, no auto thrust, no speed protection, and your lateral control, which is how you roll left and right, loses protection too, so the aircraft flies more like an older Boeing model aircraft. When the pitot tubes iced over, the aircraft transitioned to alternate law 2, but Pierre didn't realize it. That meant when the autopilot kicked off and he rolled left to try and stabilize the aircraft, the control stick was a lot more sensitive than what he was used to, and he rolled faster than normal and overcorrected. For the next 30 seconds, the aircraft rolled left and right as he struggled to adjust to the handling characteristics. In the middle of all that, for some reason, he also pulled back sharply on the control stick, raising the nose, and the aircraft began to climb as fast as 7,000 feet per minute. During that climb, the airspeed decayed from 274 knots down to only 52 knots, but they didn't realize it because neither of them had a valid airspeed indication. That's when the stall warning sounded, but it only lasted about 3 seconds because Pierre just so happened to release enough backstick pressure that the aircraft nose dropped and the warning stopped. At that point, they were almost 38,000 feet in the air, and David knew they had a problem. So he yelled again at Pierre saying, "You're going up, so go back down, go back down." That's when Pierre pushed the thrust levers full forward for maximum power, but unfortunately he continued to pull back on the control stick, keeping the aircraft in a stalled condition as they began falling out of the sky. Now the worst part about all of this was that because it happened during the middle of the night, it's very dark outside, and when you combine that with the bad weather conditions, it was extremely disorienting, and both pilots struggled to understand what was happening, especially because of the overwhelming number of warnings and faulty instrument readings. By now, they were falling out of the sky at a rate of over 10,000 feet per minute, with an angle of attack greater than 40 degrees. David tried to save the aircraft by taking over the controls, pressing the priority button on his control stick, which would override what Pierre was doing, but Pierre ignored him and pushed his own priority button and assumed control of the aircraft again. As the two pilots were fighting each other over control of the aircraft, they continued to plummet out of the sky, and 90 seconds into their battle with the aircraft, the captain re-entered the cockpit. He tried to figure out what was happening, but because Pierre was still pulling back on the control stick, the angle of attack was so high that all of the airspeed indications were invalid and the stall warnings had stopped. As the aircraft kept falling, David said to himself, "Climb, climb," and Pierre replied, "I've been maximum nose up for a while." When the captain heard that, he finally realized they were in a stall and he yelled, "Don't climb." The only problem now is that the captain was standing behind the two first officers and he couldn't reach the controls to take over. David asked for the controls and Pierre finally let go, but by that point it was too late. During the 3.5 minutes of their descent in a stall, the angle of attack never dropped below 35 degrees, and they impacted the ocean at a rate of over 10,000 feet per minute. All 228 passengers and crew on board died on impact, and the aircraft was destroyed. The investigation determined that although the icing of the pitot tubes set things in motion, the crew failed to recognize the aircraft had stalled, and they made incorrect control inputs that made things worse, and ultimately they failed to follow the appropriate recovery procedure. As tragic as this was, it's amazing that the investigation was able to determine what happened during this flight, even though it took them about 2 years to locate the wreckage at the bottom of the ocean. Now, the good news is that what they learned led to significant changes in the industry, including improved pitot tube designs and additional training for pilots regarding stall recognition and recovery. The next deadly disaster on our list took place on August 6, 1997, and it involved Korean Air Flight 801 in the United States territory of Guam, and it remains the deadliest aviation disaster in the United States that still had survivors. The aircraft they were flying was a 1984 Boeing 747-300, and the pilot flying the plane was 42-year-old Captain Park, who was highly experienced with almost 9,000 hours of total flight time, including over 3,100 hours flying the 747. In fact, not long prior to the crash, Captain Park had received a Flight Safety Award for landing a 747 after it suffered an engine failure at low altitude. Sitting in the right seat was 40-year-old First Officer Sun, who had over 4,000 hours of total flight time with about 1,500 hours on the 747. Also up front was the 57-year-old Flight Engineer Nam, who had over 13,000 flight hours. Most of the flight was relatively uneventful until shortly after 1 a.m. local time when they were getting ready to land, and that's when everything started to go wrong. As they approached the airfield, heavy rains covered most of Guam, and the visibility was 7 miles with scattered clouds at 1,600 feet, broken clouds at 2,500 feet, and overcast at 5,000. The crew planned to fly the ILS for runway 6 left, and this should have been a routine approach and landing. The NTSB created this animation of the event, and even though you can see the runway off in the distance, keep in mind that it's nighttime and the pilots were having a hard time seeing the runway because of the rain. That being said, the controller cleared them for the ILS runway 6 left approach, but he also told them that the glide slope was unusable. This is where it's important to remember that there are two components to an ILS. The localizer signal provides you with the lateral guidance to the runway, and the glide slope gives you the vertical guidance. Anytime that glide slope is unusable, you have to fly the approach differently, and different minimums are going to apply. You can see on the approach plate that the ILS minimums are 456 feet, but the localizer, or the glide slope out minimums, are 560 feet. Additionally, the approach also has what's commonly referred to as a step-down altitude that says the pilots can't go lower than 1,440 feet until they are past the VOR, which is 3.3 nautical miles from the runway. Now, going back to the animation, after they were told that the glide slope was unusable, the first officer read back, "Cleared ILS, runway 6 left." Almost immediately, the flight engineer asked the captain, "Is the glide slope working?" And the captain said, yes, it's working." According to the investigation, the aircraft had most likely picked up a false glide slope signal from somewhere on the ground, so even though it might have looked like they had a valid glide slope, they didn't. A few seconds later, the flight engineer said, "Check the glide slope if working, why is it working?" And the first officer responded saying, "Not usable." However, neither one of them tried to verify this with the captain, and they continued to fly the approach. About 20 seconds later, one of the crew members, most likely the flight engineer, said glide slope is incorrect, but no one acknowledged him and he didn't try to intervene. Instead, another 10 seconds goes by and the first officer said they were approaching 1,400 feet, which is the step down altitude on the approach. However, the truth is they were approaching 2,400 feet, so it's not clear if he was confused or he just misspoke. Either way, the captain replied saying that since the glide slope isn't good, they need to maintain 1,440 feet, and he asked the first officer to set it. Over the course of about the next 45 seconds, they switched radios and checked in with the tower controller, who cleared them to land on runway 6 left. At that point, they were about to reach the step-down altitude of 1,440 feet, but the captain told the first officer to go ahead and now set the altitude to 560 feet. Now here's the problem. If you look at the approach chart, if the glide slope signal was working, it would have kept them on a steady 3-degree path down to the runway, keeping them at a safe altitude above that step-down altitude fix. Unfortunately, because they were following a false glide slope signal, they were descending well below the normal glide path. In fact, when they descended through 1,440 feet, they were still over 5 miles away from the runway and over 1.5 miles away from the VOR. 10 seconds later, the captain asked, "Isn't the glide slope working?" But no one answered him, and they started talking about turning the windshield wipers on and the landing checklist. They soon got a ground proximity warning telling them they were only 500 feet above the ground, but instead of trying to figure out why they got that warning, they kept running the landing checklist. Eventually, they got a sink rate warning, and the first officer said, "Sink rate, okay?" He paused for a moment, and then he said, "Let's make a missed approach." At the same time, the flight engineer tried warning them that they were only 200 feet above the ground. By the time the captain finally called for the go-around, they were only 100 feet above the mountain below them. The aircraft GipWhiz continued to count down their height above the ground until they crashed into the terrain about 3.3 miles from the runway, right next to the VOR, killing 229 out of the 254 people on board the aircraft. The investigation blamed the captain for failing to adequately brief and fly the approach, but they also blamed the first officer and the flight engineer for not sufficiently monitoring the approach and challenging the captain for his errors. Now, in my opinion, the most shocking thing about this entire tragedy is the fact that it seemed like they all knew that something was wrong, but they weren't willing to do anything about it. In fact, they seemed to be distracted trying to run the landing checklist instead of focusing on flying the actual instrument approach. Our next tragedy took place on April 26, 1994, when 271 people boarded China Airlines Flight 140 to fly from Taiwan to the Nagoya airport in Japan. This should have been a routine flight, but it turned into a deadly disaster because a mistake that the pilots made killed almost everyone on board the aircraft. Tragically, this incident still remains the deadliest accident in the history of China Airlines and the second deadliest air crash in Japanese history. The aircraft they were flying was a 1991 Airbus A300, and the pilot flying the plane had over 8,300 total flight hours, including 1,350 hours on the A300. Sitting in the right seat was the first officer, who had over 1,600 total hours, with over 1,000 hours on the aircraft. According to the investigation, the first few hours of the flight were relatively uneventful. The crew got prepared and briefed the ILS approach to runway 34 and were told to contact the Nagoya Tower. The pilots had the runway in sight, and because the first officer was going to be performing the landing, he disconnected the autopilot and began hand flying the approach. About 30 seconds later, after they had been cleared to land and when they were about 1,000 feet above the ground, the first officer somehow accidentally selected toga on the thrust levers. This is the takeoff and go around mode. And when he did that, the thrust increased to the takeoff and go around power setting, and the flight director instructed him to climb manually since the autopilot was still turned off. The sudden increase in the thrust caused the aircraft nose to pitch higher, and the captain immediately recognized the problem and yelled at the first officer to disengage the go around mode. But the truth is that the first officer didn't disengage the auto thrust or the go around mode, and instead he just pushed forward on the controls and the aircraft leveled off for about 15 seconds. Now the problem was they were still flying towards the runway, so when they leveled off, they were no longer maintaining the appropriate glide path, and they got a little bit high on the approach. At that point, they should have performed a go-around because you really don't want to try and salvage a bad approach once you get below 1,000 feet above the ground. In fact, most airlines have stabilized approach criteria that need to be met before you get to 1,000 feet, so that way you can just focus on landing the aircraft instead of trying to make big changes to your pitch or power settings. However, instead of going around, for some reason the first officer decided to turn the autopilot back on. It's not clear why he did that. Maybe he thought that would help him recapture the glide slope. Either way, they had the runway in sight and he was flying the approach visually. And the thing is, neither of them said anything about the fact that he had turned the autopilot back on. The reason this was a problem was because the aircraft was still in the takeoff and go around mode. So the autopilot was still trying to climb the aircraft for the go around, and that meant it was adjusting the trim on the horizontal stab almost to the maximum nose up limit. But at the same time, the first officer kept pushing forward on the controls, trying to continue the descent. Here's where it's important to know that 9 months before this crash, Airbus had issued an advisory saying that the A300 needed to have the flight control system modified, so that way the autopilot would automatically disengage when there was enough manual control input during a go-around. This is the same update that would allow the pilots to overpower the autopilot on China Airlines Flight 676 that was the number 2 disaster on our list that took place about 4 years later. However, at this point in time, the shocking truth was that China Airlines had determined that the modification wasn't urgent, so it hadn't been made on this aircraft yet. And this was what was allowing the first officer to essentially fight the autopilot. Eventually, the first officer had almost full forward stick deflection, while the autopilot had full nose-up trim. And at that point, he disconnected the auto thrust and reduced the thrust to idle, hoping to somehow salvage the situation. Now they were descending at a very nose-high attitude, and he finally realized he was fighting the autopilot, so he disengaged it, but that didn't change the trim setting, so he was still trying to bring the nose down. As they were descending through 500 feet, the captain decided to take over the controls and he called for a go-around. As he increased the thrust, it caused the nose to pitch even higher, and by that point it was too late. For the next 30 seconds, the pilot struggled to understand why the aircraft kept climbing as the airspeed began to rapidly decay. They ended up being about 1,800 feet above the ground before the aircraft finally stalled and came crashing down next to the runway. 271 people were on board the aircraft and only 7 managed to survive. The investigation later discovered that the A300 flight simulator the pilots had trained on had been updated with the flight control modification, thus reinforcing the pilots' belief that the autopilot had disengaged when they were pushing forward on the controls. However, they determined the root cause of the tragedy was the captain's failure to take control of the situation as soon as it began, and I agree with that 100%. There was no reason the captain should have allowed the situation to get out of control as much as he did. He should have taken over the controls at 1,000 feet and performed a go-around since they were no longer flying a stabilized approach. That being said, we only have a few more disasters to talk about, including one of the most talked about and deadliest disasters in aviation history. But before we get to that, we need to talk about a disaster that happened in New York City. The next disaster on our list took place on November 12, 2001, when American Airlines Flight 587, an Airbus A300, took off from John F. Kennedy Airport and crashed in a neighborhood in Queens about 2 minutes later. Now, when this happened, it had only been about 2 months since the 9/11 attacks in New York City, so a lot of people initially thought this was another terrorist attack. However, it turned out to be the result of a pilot mistake, and unfortunately, it became the second deadliest aviation accident in U.S. history, as well as the second deadliest aviation accident involving an Airbus A300. That being said, when it comes to American Airlines Flight 587, 42-year-old Captain Edward States was the pilot monitoring the flight, and he had over 8,000 hours of total flight time, including almost 3,500 hours on the A300. Sitting next to him was 34-year-old First Officer Sten Mullen, who was the pilot flying the aircraft. Sten had around 4,400 hours of total flight time and about 1,800 hours on the A300. As they were getting ready for takeoff, they were number 2 in line, and at 9:11:08, the tower cleared a Japan Airlines Boeing 747 for takeoff and then cautioned American Airlines 587 about the wake turbulence and told them to taxi into position and hold on runway 31 left. As they pulled onto the runway, the captain passed the controls to the first officer, who would be the one performing the takeoff, and at 9:13:28, the tower cleared Flight 587 for takeoff. However, the first officer immediately asked the captain if he was happy with their separation, and about 3 seconds later, the captain said, "We'll be all right once we get rolling. He's supposed to be 5 miles by the time we're airborne." The first officer replied saying, "So you're happy?" And 5 seconds later, they started their takeoff roll. Now, just to be clear, what they're talking about is the separation that they need when they're taking off behind the Boeing 747 that's out in front of them. And in my opinion, even though the first officer isn't the pilot in command of the aircraft, if he's not ready to begin the takeoff, then it's his job to say something, especially since he's the one flying the plane. Typically, when an aircraft the size of the A300 is taking off behind a 747, you want to have at least 2 minutes of separation. Unfortunately, the investigation discovered that because the Japan Airlines 747 took about 20 to 30 seconds to get going after they were cleared for takeoff, that meant that by the time American Airlines 587 lifted off, they were only 1 minute and 40 seconds behind them. Now, I know that might not seem like a big deal, but this was the start of all of their problems because both aircraft just so happened to be flying the exact same routing on the departure. The initial takeoff was uneventful, and about 90 seconds after getting airborne, the captain made contact with the departure controller, and they were told to climb and maintain 13,000 feet. And as they began the climb, that's when everything started to go wrong. About 30 seconds later, as they were climbing through about 2,400 feet, they hit the wake turbulence from the Japan Airlines flight in front of them. Normally, this isn't a big deal, and I promise you that it's not a threat that passengers need to be worried about. Regrettably, the problem at that time was the American Airlines pilot training program tended to exaggerate the effects of wake turbulence, and they had actually created a scenario in the simulator where turbulence from a 747 would cause your aircraft to roll 90 degrees, even though what was most likely to happen was only a small roll of about 5 to 10 degrees. That meant all of the American Airlines pilots were being trained to overreact in this situation. As a result, when the first officer recognized the wake turbulence, he started overcorrecting and the aircraft settled for a brief moment, but then moments later they hit the wake turbulence again. At that point, the first officer began making rapid rudder inputs going from full left to full right rudder. The control wheel was also moving left and right, going as far as 64 degrees to the right, and then back to 78 degrees or full to the left. The resulting side slip forces generated aerodynamic loads of over 200,000 pounds of force on the rudder, more than double the design limit of the aircraft. Tragically, about 30 seconds after they initially encountered the wake turbulence, the forces were too much and the vertical stabilizer separated from the aircraft, and the aircraft pitched down and entered a flat spin. To make matters worse, the forces of the spin sheared both of the engines from the aircraft moments before they crashed into a neighborhood in Queens. All 260 people aboard the aircraft died in the crash, and 5 people on the ground were also killed. The most shocking part of this tragedy was that the investigation determined that if the first officer had just neutralized the controls when they hit the wake turbulence, the aircraft would have stabilized and leveled off on its own, and the accident would have been avoided. The investigation determined that the plane crash was due to the first officer's unnecessary and excessive rudder pedal inputs, which perhaps were the result of some of the training he had received, as well as the characteristics of the A300 rudder design system. Now, before we look at the next disaster on our list, I just want to remind everyone that this crash happened over 20 years ago. And the truth is that flying commercial airlines today is safer than it has ever been in the history of aviation. And I know these debriefs might sometimes cause people to be worried, but in my opinion, as a commercial airline pilot, there's no reason anyone should be concerned about flying on a major airline today. The next disaster on our list happened on August 19, 1980, and it involved Saudi Flight 163 that caught on fire shortly after takeoff, but the shocking truth is they didn't crash, and that's not even the worst part of the entire story. Saudi Flight 163 was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar aircraft, which is a medium to long-range, wide-body airliner with 3 engines. And not only was this the deadliest disaster involving the TriStar, it was the deadliest one that took place in Saudi Arabia. The captain of the flight was 38 years old and had over 7,500 hours of total flight time, but only 388 hours in the TriStar. According to the investigation, his training records described him as a slow learner, and they said he needed more training. The first officer flying with him was just 26 years old and had about 1,600 hours of total flight time. However, he had just finished training on the TriStar 11 days prior to the disaster and only had 125 hours in the aircraft. Additionally, at one point during his training, he was removed from the flight school because of his poor performance. If that's not bad enough, there was also the flight engineer on board who had qualified as a captain on the DC-3, but was then assigned to train on the Boeing 707 or the 737, but failed to qualify as either a captain or a first officer on both of those. As a result, the airlines made him pay for his own training as a flight engineer on the TriStar in order for him to keep his job, and he only had about 157 hours on the TriStar when the disaster happened. The crew took off from the airport in Saudi Arabia, and when they were about 7 minutes into the flight, they got a warning of smoke in the cargo compartment. This is a very dangerous situation and typically one of the emergency scenarios that airline pilots train for on a regular basis. The reason why it can be so dangerous is because of how quickly a fire can get out of control depending on the type of cargo that you're carrying and what fire suppression capability you have. The crew spent 4 minutes and 21 seconds trying to confirm the warnings, and that's when the captain decided to return to the airport. Meanwhile, the flight engineer had gone to the back of the cabin and confirmed that they now had a fire in the cabin. 5 minutes later, as the captain was trying to get the aircraft slowed down for the descent and landing, he realized that the thrust lever for the number 2 engine was jammed, but he didn't know the reason why was because the fire had already burned through the operating cable. Either way, 4 minutes later, he decided to shut down that engine during the final approach to get his airspeed under control. They probably could have saved a few minutes if they had reacted more quickly to the situation, but the truth is that despite their limited amount of experience flying the TriStar and the difficulties they had in training, they managed to land the aircraft just 28 minutes after taking off, which was about 21 minutes after the fire started. That being said, once they landed, that's when the worst mistakes happened. Typically, when you have a confirmed cargo fire, you want to stop straight ahead on the runway, and while you're flying the approach, you want to review the emergency evacuation plan if you have time to, and also if you have time, you want to talk to the flight attendants about what to expect after landing and how to evacuate. Shockingly, they didn't do any of that. In fact, just before they landed, for some reason, the captain gave the instruction to not evacuate the aircraft. Additionally, after they landed, the captain decided to taxi down to the end of the runway, and then he turned off onto one of the taxiways, stopping 2 minutes and 40 seconds after they had landed. One of the reasons they delayed and took that time to taxi was that the crew asked the control tower if they could see a fire, and the tower said no. Now let me be clear, if you have smoke filling up the cabin of your aircraft and warnings going off telling you that you have a fire, then you probably have a fire even if the tower can't see it. Eventually, the pilots said they were going to shut down the engines and evacuate, but the engines weren't actually shut down until 3 minutes and 15 seconds after the aircraft came to a stop, which was about 6 minutes after they landed. At that point, everyone should have gotten off the aircraft fairly quickly, but the problem was that the cabin remained pressurized during the landing roll, even though it should have depressurized automatically after they touched down. That meant no one on board the aircraft was able to open any of the emergency exit doors. Ground personnel were finally able to open the second door on the right side of the aircraft 23 minutes after the engine shut down. Tragically, by that point, it was too late, and the 287 passengers and 14 crew members died, and no one could figure out why the captain failed to evacuate the aircraft in a timely manner. The investigation autopsies later determined that the passengers died because of the smoke inhalation before the fire consumed the aircraft. That being said, there's no excuse for what happened in this tragedy, and I think it serves as a good reminder that if you have a fire inside the aircraft, you need to get on the ground and evacuate as soon as possible. We're almost at the end of our list of the 10 deadliest pilot mistakes in aviation history, and the next one we're going to take a look at happened on November 12th, 1996. and it involved a midair collision between Saudi Flight 763 flying a Boeing 747 from India to Saudi Arabia with 312 people on board, and Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 907 flying an IL-76 from Kazakhstan to India with 37 passengers and crew. The Saudi flight had just taken off from the airport in Delhi as a Kazakhstan flight was preparing to land. They were both talking to the same air traffic controller, and the Saudi flight was cleared to climb to 10,000 feet, while at the same time the Kazakhstan flight was directed to descend to 15,000 feet when they were about 75 miles from the airfield. And basically what was happening was the two flights were on the same airway but going opposite directions. The controller eventually cleared the Saudi flight to climb and maintain 14,000, and that would have kept them 1,000 feet below the Kazakhstan flight in front of them, and everything should have been fine. The Saudi pilots asked for a higher altitude, but the controller denied their request and told them to remain at 14,000 feet because of the traffic in front of them. 1 minute later, the Kazakhstan pilots reported that they had reached their assigned altitude of 15,000 feet. However, the truth was that they were at 16,348 feet and still descending. That's when the controller told them that the Saudi flight would pass below them, and the Kazakhstan pilots began a visual search. The biggest problem, though, is that the two pilots on the Kazakhstan flight didn't speak English, so they had to rely on a radio operator that flew with them for all of their communications with air traffic control, and that radio operator sat behind them and didn't have any instruments to reference. So even though he was the one talking to the controllers, he had to look over the shoulder of the pilots in front of him to confirm that they were actually following the instructions. It's not clear why, but for some reason the Kazakhstan pilots descended through their assigned altitude of 15,000 feet, even going just below 14,000 feet, the same altitude the Saudi flight was at. A few seconds before impact, the Kazakhstan radio operator finally recognized they were below their assigned altitude, and he told the pilots to climb, but tragically this led them to climb directly into the path of the Saudi flight, and the tail of the Kazakhstan aircraft clipped the left wing of the Saudi flight, severing both parts from their respective planes. The shocking truth is that if Kazakhstan hadn't climbed at the last second to try and avoid the Saudi flight, they likely would have passed under them and everyone would have survived. However, the crash killed 349 people on board both planes, making it the world's deadliest mid-air collision, and the investigation that followed led to significant changes in international flight regulations, particularly in air traffic control communication protocols and the mandatory use of English as a common aviation language. And now that you've heard what happened with that disaster, it's finally time to talk about the deadliest aviation disaster in history. The final disaster on our list took place on March 27, 1977, involving two fully loaded Boeing 747s that collided on the runway in what would soon become the most talked about aviation disaster in history. The story begins when a bomb was set off at an airport in the Canary Islands that caused several flights to be diverted to what is now known as the Tenerife North Airport on the Spanish island of Tenerife. One of those aircraft was KLM Flight 4805, and the other was Pan Am Flight 1736. One of the biggest factors in this crash was the weather. There were thick patches of fog across the airfield, but what made this worse was the low clouds. Because the airport sits at an elevation of about 630 meters or 2,000 feet, it can sometimes be in the middle of the clouds. And when you combine that with a little bit of wind, the visibility can go from several hundred meters to zero in a matter of a few minutes, and your visibility can also vary based on your location on the airfield. When it comes to the pilots, the Pan Am captain had 21,000 total hours, with 564 hours on the 747, and his first officer had over 10,000 total hours, with about 2,800 hours on the aircraft. Additionally, their flight engineer had over 15,000 hours with over 500 hours on the 747. The captain flying for KLM had over 11,700 total flight hours, including over 1,500 hours on the 747. However, he was also KLM's chief flight instructor, and he had even been recently featured in an advertisement for the airline. His first officer had over 9,000 total flight hours, but he only had 95 hours of experience on the 747. Also in the cockpit was their flight engineer, who had 17,000 hours, including 543 hours in the aircraft. Even though both of the crews had a lot of experience when it comes to their total flight time, there was a big difference between the KLM captain and his first officer when it came to the amount of time they had on the 747. When you combine that with the fact that the captain was the airline's chief flight instructor, it created a very unique situation in the cockpit where the first officer and even the flight engineer were somewhat reluctant to question the captain. The other thing you need to understand about this tragedy is that when all of these aircraft diverted, no one was expecting them. The airport didn't have the room or the services to take care of them. The airport only had one runway and one major taxiway running parallel to it, and the ground controller was having to park aircraft on the taxiway because they didn't have room on the ramp. The reason this was a problem was because in order for airplanes to take off, they couldn't use the taxiway to get down to the end of the runway, and instead they had to back taxi down the runway. This meant they would pull onto the runway and then go down to the other end and do a 180. The Pan Am crew was ready to leave, but because their access to the runway was blocked by the KLM aircraft and a refueling truck, they had to wait. Eventually, KLM was ready to go, and the tower told KLM to taxi down the entire runway and then make a 180-degree turn to get in the takeoff position. Shortly afterward, Pan Am was instructed to follow KLM down the same runway, but take the third exit on their left and then use the parallel taxiway to keep going towards the end of the runway. Now, there were a few big problems with these instructions. First of all, the Pan Am pilots were confused and they asked the controller to verify which taxiway to exit on, and the controller told them emphatically the third one. The second problem was that there weren't any signs or markings to identify the taxiway exits off the runway. So the Pan Am pilots were having to mentally keep track of which ones they had passed so they could figure out which one to exit on. And the third problem was the visibility was so poor that the pilots had a difficult time even seeing the taxiways until they were almost right on top of them. Finally, the fourth problem was that taking the third taxiway meant that they would need to turn almost 150 degrees to exit, followed by another 150-degree turn to rejoin the parallel taxiway. The investigation later determined this would have been practically impossible to do and highlighted the controller's lack of familiarity handling an aircraft as big as the 747. As a result of all of these issues, the Pan Am crew continued past the third exit and started towards the fourth taxiway, which made a lot more sense for them to use. Meanwhile, the KLM aircraft lined up for takeoff, and almost immediately the captain advanced the throttles and the first officer told him that they hadn't been cleared for takeoff. Instead of stopping right there, for some reason the captain brushed off the concern and said, "I know that, go ahead, ask." That's when the first officer radioed the tower saying they were ready for takeoff and waiting for our ATC clearance. The tower called them back, giving them their departure routing, and even though the controller used the word takeoff in the radio call, he did not give them a clearance to take off. At that point, the first officer or the flight engineer should have said something like, "Captain, stand by, we don't have takeoff clearance yet." Instead, the first officer just read back the clearance to the controller and told the controller, "We are now at takeoff," and the captain stepped on the radio to interrupt him, saying, "We're going." This was an extremely reckless decision because the captain is essentially doing whatever he wants to do regardless of what anyone else said. Even though the tower controller should have told him negative, hold your position, he just said okay on the radio, and then he said stand by for takeoff, I will call you. Now this is where all of the last holes in the Swiss cheese are lining up, because at the same time the controller told KLM to stand by, the Pan Am crew was trying to make a call on the radio saying, "Hey, we're still taxiing down the runway." Unfortunately, that radio call caused mutual interference, and we know from the cockpit voice recording that the KLM crew never heard the standby call from the tower or Pan Am's call warning them that they were still on the runway. Meanwhile, the tower controller can't see either of these two aircraft because of the clouds and the fog, so he has no idea that KLM has started their takeoff roll, and he asked Pan Am to report clear of the runway. The Pan Am replied, "Okay, we'll report when clear." Upon hearing this, the KLM flight engineer immediately questioned the captain if Pan Am was clear, and the KLM captain said, "Oh yes," and continued with the takeoff. Unfortunately, he was wrong, and by the time the KLM pilots saw the Pan Am aircraft, they were already moving too fast to stop. They rotated early, trying to climb clear of Pan Am, but they didn't make it, and they collided on the runway, destroying both aircraft in the process. 248 passengers and crew on board the KLM flight died, and 335 passengers and crew on the Pan Am flight also perished. This disaster offered numerous lessons for the aviation community regarding the importance of communication, and sweeping changes were made to international airline regulations, and aviation authorities introduced requirements for standard phrases between pilots and controllers. This is why the word takeoff is now only spoken when actual takeoff clearance is given or when canceling that same clearance. To this day, this remains the deadliest accident in aviation history. Now, I hope you found this review of the 10 deadliest pilot mistakes helpful. There's definitely a lot more that could have been said about every single one of these tragedies. In fact, I probably could have made 10 separate videos, but my goal was to give you a quick refresher on the mistakes that were made so that hopefully we can avoid similar mistakes in the future. If you found this video helpful, then you might enjoy this other video about the 10 deadliest airshow disasters in history that's on your screen right now, so be sure to watch that next, and thank you so much for your support.